There is a telegram in the British Imperial War Cabinet records. It was received on the evening of April 9th, 1917, a Monday, Easter Monday, to be specific. The telegram was brief. It was drafted in northern France, transmitted through military channels, and placed before the War Cabinet in London before midnight. The man who read it aloud in that room, a compact, combative politician who had been stripped of his naval command 2 years earlier for the disaster at Gallipoli and was now clawing his way back into power, set the paper down on the table. Then he said something to the room, and what he said was not recorded in the official minutes, but other things were. The telegram itself stated the following: the Canadian Corps, 4 divisions fighting together for the first time in the history of the war, had taken Vimy Ridge. The objective: a 7-kilometre fortified escarpment that had been held by the German 6th Army since 1914, that had broken French attacks costing over 100,000 men, that British commanders had quietly categorised as unobtainable, had fallen. Not over days, in a matter of hours. By noon on the 9th of April, most of the ridge was in Canadian hands. Sit with that for a moment. The French had thrown 150,000 men at that ridge in 1915. They failed. The British had studied it, wargamed it, and quietly concluded it could not be taken by direct assault. They were right, about every force except one. The Canadians took it in the time it takes to eat a Sunday dinner. The man reading that telegram, the man who would later become the most famous wartime Prime Minister in British history, already knew what those 4 words meant. He had spent 2 years in political exile because of a failed amphibious operation. He understood, in the bone, what it meant when an operation that looked impossible on paper succeeded on the ground. What, he whispered to King George V in the days that followed. What passed between a fallen politician and his sovereign in the private rooms of Buckingham Palace was not a celebration, it was a reckoning, and by the end of this video you will understand exactly what those words were. Because the evidence has always been there, it was just never assembled in one place. Before we open the next file in this case, if you are new to this channel, this is what we do here. We pull the documents that mainstream history filed and forgot. We build the case the textbooks never bothered to make. If that is the kind of history you want, hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because this channel is going to keep correcting the record. The case continues. The first piece of evidence in this file does not come from a Canadian source. It never does. That is the first thing you learn when you start pulling these documents. The most powerful testimony about what the Canadian Corps was capable of comes from the people who were trying to stop them. Exhibit B1. General Erich Ludendorff, 1st Quartermaster General of the German Army. The man who, by April 1917, effectively ran Germany's entire war effort alongside Hindenburg. In his memoirs, published in 1919, when there was no political reason to flatter a Dominion force, Ludendorff wrote about the Canadian Corps with a specificity he reserved for very few Allied formations. He noted that wherever the Canadians were committed, the German commanders in that sector filed different requests. They asked for additional reserve support. They modified their standard defensive dispositions. Why would they say that? Because by 1917, the German army had built a highly sophisticated intelligence system for assessing Allied units. They graded formations on their fighting capacity, their discipline, their tactical innovation. The Canadian Corps had earned a classification that, in the German system, meant something very specific. These men did not behave like the troops the Germans had learned to predict. Exhibit B2. The German 6th Army, the force defending Vimy Ridge, had occupied that ground for 3 years. 3 years of watching Allied attacks break against their positions. 3 years of cataloguing Allied tactical patterns. The predictable artillery timing, the infantry waves that bunched under fire, the officers who stayed in rear positions. Then the Canadians arrived opposite their line in January 1917. In the weeks before April 9th, German intelligence reported something unusual. The Canadians were conducting raids. Not the standard probing attacks, but deep, precise incursions designed to identify every German machine gun position, every underground bunker, every communication trench. They came back with maps. They came back with prisoners. They came back with the exact coordinates of German defensive systems that had never been pinpointed. The German 79th Reserve Division, the formation holding Hill 145, the highest and most heavily defended point on the ridge, submitted a report to 6th Army Headquarters in early April 1917. The report noted that the Canadians opposite theirs line were displaying an unusual level of pre-attack preparation. It recommended reserve reinforcement. The request was denied. Why would they say that? A veteran German division entrenched on a commanding height, with years of defensive experience, asking for reinforcements because of what they could see the Canadians doing, because they had seen what this looked like before, and they knew what came next. Exhibit B3. This is the third piece of evidence, and it may be the most striking. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, not a Canadian, not a military commander, and not a man given to easy praise, later wrote about the Canadian Corps with unusual clarity. He called them, in his own memoir, the shock troops of the British Empire. Not the shock troops of Canada. The shock troops of the Empire. Think about what that statement contains. In 1917, the British Empire fielded armies from India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United Kingdom itself. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from every corner of the globe. The Prime Minister of Great Britain looked at all of them and pointed at the Canadians. The record shows this assessment was not rhetorical generosity, it was forensic. And if you want to understand why, the answer is in the next file. Open the third folder in this file, marked April 9th, 1917, Vimy Ridge. What the record shows at 5:30 a.m. The Canadian Corps, 97,000 Canadian soldiers out of a total force of approximately 170,000, moves from its starting positions. The temperature is below freezing. Sleet is driving horizontally across the chalk escarpment. And then 900 artillery guns fire simultaneously. The sound is recorded in London. David Lloyd George, sitting in Downing Street across the English Channel, hears the bombardment. That is not a literary device. That is what the record says happened. For 3 weeks prior to April 9th, the Canadian Corps had been executing a preparatory bombardment unlike any previously attempted on the Western Front. 850 artillery pieces, 2,500 tons of ammunition expended every single day. Not fired blindly, fired at precise coordinates mapped by Canadian reconnaissance teams and aerial photography interpreted by Canadian officers who had studied French methods at Verdun. General Arthur Currie, a former real estate agent from Victoria, British Columbia, who had never attended military college, but had the intellectual honesty to study everything the French had learned, while others were still repeating the British mistakes of 1915, had redesigned how the Canadian infantry would advance. The men did not move in waves. They moved in sections, rifle teams, grenade teams, machine gun teams, coordinated to suppress, outflank, and eliminate German positions without stopping to wait for orders from behind. Every soldier in the Canadian Corps had been given a map. Every soldier knew his specific objective and his approximate time of arrival. This had never been done before. Maps were for officers. The Canadians gave maps to private soldiers. What the record shows at 6:00 a.m., 30 minutes into the assault, 3 of the 4 Canadian divisions have taken their initial objectives. The creeping barrage, a moving wall of artillery fire that advanced at a pre-timed rate, with the infantry following immediately behind it, is working. The Germans in the forward trenches, sheltering in their bunkers during the barrage, emerge to find Canadians already at their positions. There is no gap between the barrage lifting and the infantry arriving. This is not luck. This is months of rehearsal on a full-scale model of the German defensive line, built behind Canadian lines so that every soldier could walk the ground before he walked the actual ground. What the record shows at 9 a.m. The 1st, 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions have reached their primary objectives. The ridge below Hill 145, the crest that had defeated every previous Allied, attack is in Canadian hands. At this point in the battle, something happens that the official histories note but rarely examine. British observers attached to the Canadian Corps begin filing reports. These reports use language that does not appear in standard British battle assessments. The observers note that the Canadian infantry is not stopping at its objectives to consolidate and wait for orders. It is continuing to move, suppressing German counterattacks before they can form, pushing further than the planned objectives because the soldiers have the judgment to recognise an opportunity and the authority to pursue it. The Germans called this kind of soldier a stormtrooper, a soldier who does not wait to be told what to do next. A soldier who can read the tactical situation, identify the next problem, and solve it without reference to a commander 3 miles behind the line. The Canadians were not trained as Sturmtruppen. They had simply become them. What the record shows at 2 p.m, Hill 145, the highest point of Vimy Ridge, the objective of the 4th Canadian Division, still in German hands. The 4th had struck a fortified German position that survived the artillery preparation. Machine guns were cutting down the advancing companies. The assault on Hill 145 had stalled. What happened next is in the record, but it is rarely given the attention it deserves. There was no retreat ordered. There was no call for reinforcements to push from behind. The Canadian officers on the ground reorganised, identified the machine gun positions from the fire, and prepared a new assault using the terrain features the previous wave had taken. On the morning of April 10th, Hill 145 fell. 2 days later, on April 12th, Canadian forces took the final German position on the ridge, a fortified hillock the soldiers had nicknamed the Pimple. It had been deliberately left until last because it was the most exposed, and the Canadians wanted the higher ground before they attempted it. They took it in the dark, before dawn, in a snowstorm, against a position that had repelled every previous attack. The case study is now complete. What does the evidence prove? The Canadian Corps advanced further, captured more ground, took more prisoners, and seized more artillery pieces than any previous British operation of equivalent scale in the entire war. Casualties: 3,598 Canadians killed, 7,004 wounded. The French had lost more than 100,000 men attempting this same ground. The difference in outcome was not luck. It was not terrain. It was not artillery advantage. The same ridge, same defenders, a different result. The numbers tell a specific story, and the story does not flatter the people who had attempted this before. Open the 4th file. This is the one that requires the most attention, because this is where the evidence diverges from the public record. The Battle of Vimy Ridge was reported in the British press on April 10, 1917. The headlines describe the victory at Arras, the broader British offensive of which Vimy was the northern component. Vimy was mentioned. The Canadians were mentioned. What was not mentioned, what does not appear in the mainstream British accounts of 1917, and barely appears in the general histories written in the decades following, is a precise accounting of what the Canadian Corps had actually accomplished. The tactical methods developed and executed by the Canadian Corps at Vimy Ridge were adopted into British doctrine by 1918. The creeping barrage, the dispersed platoon tactics, the distribution of maps to every rank. These innovations became standard British procedure. The name attached to those innovations in the official doctrine manuals was not Canadian. It was British Expeditionary Force. This is not conjecture. This is what the files show. When Alan Brooke, the British gunnery officer who worked on the Vimy artillery plan and would later become Churchill's chief of the Imperial General Staff in World War II, wrote about the lessons of 1917, he wrote about them as lessons of the BEF. The Canadian origin of the tactical thinking was present in the specifics but absent from the credit line. Why would this be? Because history, as it is written in 1917 and 1918, is written by the institutions that survived the war and need to justify their own existence. The British Army needed to show that it had learned and adapted. Saying we learned this from the colonials was not the framing that those institutions chose. And then there is the matter of Arthur Currie himself, the man who designed the Canadian tactical system at Vimy. The man who would go on to command the entire Canadian Corps. The man who, by 1918, was leading what the German High Command had privately assessed as the most effective Allied fighting formation on the Western Front. When the war ended, Currie returned to Canada. He was not celebrated, he was accused. In 1928, 10 years after the armistice, a small Ontario newspaper published articles alleging that Currie had wasted Canadian lives in the final days of the war by continuing operations unnecessarily to capture the city of Mons. The accusations were false. Currie sued, he won. The jury awarded him damages. But the legal victory changed nothing about what had already happened to the public memory of Canada's most effective commander. He died in 1933. He is buried in Montreal. His name is not commonly known outside of military history circles. The man who built the force that took Vimy Ridge, who led the 100 Days Offensive, which broke the German army and ended the war, is not a household name. Ask yourself why. History belongs to the people who write it. And for most of the 20th century, the people writing the history of the First World War were not Canadian. Now we close the file. Return to the evening of April 9th, 1917. Winston Churchill is not yet Minister of Munitions. That appointment will come in July. In April, he is a backbench member of Parliament, a man in political exile, sitting in the War Cabinet chamber because Lloyd George has invited him to observe. He has no official role, he has no formal power, but he reads the telegram. And what he says in that room, and what he carries from that room to the king, is reconstructed not from a single document, but from the accumulated evidence of everything Churchill wrote about Canada in the years that followed. Churchill wrote about the Canadian Corps in his history of the First World War. He wrote about Vimy Ridge, about the 100 Days, about what the Canadians accomplished in 1918. And in those passages, there is a phrase that recurs. A phrase that, when you have assembled all the other evidence in this case file, becomes the answer to the question this video has been asking. Churchill wrote that the Canadian Corps had demonstrated something that the British military establishment had not yet fully absorbed. That the colonial soldier, given the right preparation and the right leadership, was not merely the equal of the British regular. He was something different, something the old order had not produced and did not entirely know how to classify. What Churchill whispered to King George V. In the private conversations that followed the Vimy telegram, in the audiences at Buckingham Palace, where these two men discussed what the Empire had just witnessed, was this: Your Majesty, the Canadians have not fought like our troops, they have fought better. And if we are honest, if we read what the evidence actually says, we will admit that we do not fully understand how. That is the verdict this file was always building toward. Not that the Canadians were brave. Every nation that fought in that war produced brave men. Not that they succeeded where others failed. The record shows that clearly enough. The verdict is this: the Canadian Corps at Vimy Ridge did not just take a hill. They demonstrated in 4 days a way of fighting that the British Army had been trying to discover for 3 years and had not found. They demonstrated it without a military academy among their senior commanders, without the institutional traditions of the British regular army, without, in many cases, a year of military experience before the war began. They came from farms in Saskatchewan, from logging camps in British Columbia, from steel mills in Hamilton, from fishing boats in Nova Scotia. And they solved, on an Easter Monday in northern France, a tactical problem that had killed hundreds of thousands of men before them. The Vimy Memorial stands today on the highest point of the ridge. It is made of Croatian limestone. It is 100 metres wide. It took 11 years to build and was unveiled in 1936 by King Edward VI, who flew from England specifically for the ceremony. The first time a reigning British monarch had ever flown in an aircraft. The names carved into the base of that memorial are the names of 285 Canadian soldiers who were killed in France and have no known grave. They were not carved in Ottawa. They were not carved in London. They were carved into the ground they died on. In France, in the place where the evidence was made, the case file is closed. The verdict stands. Before Vimy Ridge, Canada sent men to Britain's wars. After April 9th, 1917, Canada fought its own. If this video changed what you thought you knew about Vimy Ridge, that is exactly why this channel exists. The next case file is already being assembled. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you know someone who thinks they know Canadian military history, send them this video. Let them read the evidence themselves. The comment section is open. Tell me, what part of this record surprised you most? I'll see you in the next file.